good morning, everyone. Welcome to February's Montessori mornings. Today we will be discussing normalization and deviations. As I was putting this together, it can be a bit heavy and it feels a little, a lot of pressure can be put on us, right? How do we raise the most the best children that we can, right? And so when we're talking about deviations, that can be challenging because there's a lot of obstacles that can happen on the way to normalization, but we'll talk about that. Okay, so what is normalization? Normalization is the healthy state of being that results when the natural laws of development are obeyed. So that's a little heavy. So as we know, Maria Montessori used thousands of hours of observation to guide her work. The prepared environment, i.e. materials, teacher preparation, how we set up the classroom, all respond to a child's needs. These prepared environments allow the children to really expose their true nature. And this is what she also means by normalization. When there's an environment set up for them to allow independence, concentration, that's when their true nature comes out. And that's what she means by normalization. So it is a state of being that naturally occurs when a child develops according to his or her inner guides. And this is sort of a mind and body transformation. So what does she mean when she talks about deviation? So she uses this term to describe the child's behavioral patterns, which occur when the child is confronted with an obstacle to their normal development. These happen. It happens to every child. It happens to every human being, right? We don't always have that perfect setup, prepared environment anywhere, whether we're talking about physically or emotionally. So deviations happen. And again, I think it's sort of a heavy word because when you think of deviation, right? But deviation really just means to, sort of get off the path a little bit. And that happens to all of us. So when she talks about deviation, it's the physical and physiological growth. They're not interdependent and intertwined. Development is not allowed to proceed in a normal way. All humans have deviations. Defects, as she calls them, in adults can be traced back to a lack of development in the first years of life. And I almost put in this presentation, again, we talk more recently a lot about trauma, and trauma can look different for everyone. And I think that's kind of where she was going with this, is that when there are obstacles or when some minor or major trauma occurs, this is where we then experience these deviations. And again, that can be brought on through environmental things or, in the mind, I guess you could say. So let's see. First, we'll talk about what are the characteristics of normalization. When we observe in the Montessori classroom, we look for these. The love of order, right? That's one of our human tendencies. And so if you were on the Montessori morning when we talked about human tendencies, order and work were part of those. So when we see a child sort of normalized in the classroom, we see their love of order. That is why our prepared environment is set up that way. Everything is in place and they like that. They thrive on that. Love of work. They truly like to work. They like to work on the presentations that we present. They like to do the practical life work. They like to do the math work. So the love of work. Another characteristic is the deep concentration. So even when we have a 3-year-olds coming in and they are choosing a work which some people may not think is very important or academic based, I guess, maybe like painting or working on, knobless cylinders. The whole point, not the whole point, a lot of that is really developing that concentration. And so when we can see when a child is concentrated, that's a characteristic of normalization. And when they can concentrate on a work, whether it be painting or cylinders or any of the materials that we have in our classrooms, concentration is important, and that's a characteristic. The love of reality. She talks, the child is interested in people and his surroundings. He loves to hear stories that are related to his real life. And you can probably relate to this. They love hearing about, when you were younger, or when you were a baby, or this is how we did things. They love hearing those stories of reality, right? Love of silence. The child enjoys the experience of silence. The child enjoys frequently working quietly by himself. We even have a silence game in our primary and our lower L classrooms. We call it the silence game. And that actually builds community. They are calm. They are joyful. They are non-possessive. And what we mean by that is the child is satisfied with his environment and people around him. The child is not envious of another child's abilities or objects. Even if he sees a child with more skills or objects, the child is not envious, and the child is not competitive. Well, that's hard. But the non-possessiveness can be a trait of normalization. When I'm going to go back to the love of work, she explains this. The child chooses his activity independently according to his interests. The child likes to be deeply involved with activities and finishes his activity. And when he's satisfied, he gains satisfaction through his work. And they love challenging activities. So when we talk about obedience, that means the child is willing to follow the rules which benefit the community, and he accepts the limits of the community. And they follow the guidelines given by the adult. And so oftentimes when you hear like obedient, they're not obedient because, or when we talk about it, they shouldn't be obedient because they're scared of you, right? They want to be obedient just because they want to be in that community, if that makes sense. Independence. The child is functionally and psychologically independent. He is capable of putting work away, choosing work, and being able to be somewhat self-sufficient. He has a confidence and doesn't depend on other people for direction when he doesn't need to. And he's also capable of asking for help when he needs it. And then we talk about self-discipline. The child is responsible and able to control himself. He respects other people in the physical environment. The child is disciplined even when the child is not under direct supervision of adults. So these are just some characteristics of a normalized child. Does anyone have any questions?
Can you talk about the silence game? That sounds amazing.
It's one of my favorites. So in primary, and I think in lower L too, you would stop the classroom. Some teachers have a bell, and then you'd say, we're going to play the silence game. And so everybody sits in one, the teacher's on one side of the classroom and the students are on another, and everyone's sitting. And so the teacher calls each child very quietly. So they whisper a name. So they'll say, Jackson, you can come sit by me. So the child has to stand up and walk very quietly to the other side of the room where the teacher is, and then sits down. And then the teacher will call another student's name, and they have to stand up and walk very quietly to the teacher and sit down. And so if you have 28 kids in your classroom, that can take, a long time. And it's really a community building activity, right? Because everyone has to be quiet. And you have to listen for your name. And we, as you know, we have lines in our classroom where we walk, around the line, and that's all about concentration and gross motor skills. And so the silence game also incorporates that. Can we walk quietly, purposefully through a classroom and sit down. And so the teacher continues until they call every child's name, and the children are all sitting then again on the side where the teacher is. And then we usually end it with a story, like we talked about reality, right? We end it with like a beautiful, not a storybook, but a story like from our lives. Like, oh, I had a cat once and it was a calico cat, and calico cats are mostly female, and something like this. And they're all looking and quiet. So that's the silence game. And usually you wouldn't do that in the first month of class, right? Because your community is not built yet. And it's interesting, since we have those 3s, 4s, and 5s in the primary class, the 5s, will sort of correct the 3s, like, we have to sit down and be quiet and pay attention. So it's a great community building activity. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. So deviations. Our deviations mostly develop in the first 3 years of life. Child has no way, when they're under 3, typically the child has no way to express the obstacle to development, right? Because they're not talking yet. So after 3, they then begin to express deviations in their movement, in their language. It is correctable if given the appropriate setting. If not corrected, that can then develop as part of their personality. So if deviations are neglected, they will follow them into the next plane. And we've talked about the planes of development, right? 0 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 18, and 18 into adulthood. And of course, it's harder to correct as time goes by, because then that becomes a habit and it becomes part of our personality. And of course, we can overcome deviations as an adult if you are aware of them. And I think as humans, as we grow, as we progress, we become hopefully more self-aware, and we can be more aware of what our deviations are, and try to adjust and take care of those. Okay, so what can be some causes of deviations? So the lack of conditions necessary for development. So when we restrict physical movement, this is, I think, a really important one. I feel like we've seen more and more devices for babies, for children, to keep them sort of confined, right? The little seats that they sit in, which is, good for allowing support for the back and such. But restricting physical movement, we want them to explore their environment and have them be able to move as much as possible. So like allowing the child to walk instead of going in a stroller. But yes, I'm a parent. We put them in a stroller because it's convenient. It would take forever to walk around the zoo if they were, if they were learning to walk and where. But, it's important for us to just be aware, not carrying the child when they're able to walk. Again, a lot more convenient to pick up your child. We have to go and put them in the stroller and not allow them to walk. So restricting that physical movement can play a factor in that. Sitting in the car for a long period of time, holding the child's hand, or keeping the child in a restricted place like a playpen for too long. So these things stop the child from moving freely and exploring. Of course, for safety, right? If I'm in the kitchen, my child is probably in a playpen while I'm making dinner and such. But as much as you can, we need to allow that physical, that free movement of the child. Also, when an adult opposes their will on the child. So some adults impose their will on the child intentionally, and most because of lack of understanding of the child. The adult is trying to modify the child's behavior. The child will do things for the adult's pleasure and does not have their own interest in the activity. And we can see that a lot. I'm going to do it because it pleases somebody else in the, in the environment. I'm going to do this because I was told to do it. And they don't really receive that joy from it. So as a result, right, the child will not feel satisfaction from the activity since they're looking for the adult's reaction and not the activity. So if that makes sense, that's kind of where that will then develops. You can think about that as an adult, right? When we're at our workplace and we're more invested in a project, there's some satisfaction that comes there, right? If it's a project that we're not really interested in, that doesn't breed a lot of satisfaction. So the third is the lack of necessary guidance or activities. So that means the child needs limits, particular activities. They need love, they need protection. If the child is left alone without support or structure, they will develop deviations. The deviation is a sign that the child has not been given the proper environment. The child is acting in a certain way because they can't do it any other way. And of course, we can see this, unfortunately, in students who, or in children who, sometimes I think about like when they used to talk about like the children in like orphanages and like Russia, where they're, severely restricted movement, right? When they're not giving the optimal environment for movement or for brain development, that certainly could lead to a large deviation. And we also talk about, of course, technology, right? Too much technology can cause deviations as well. And I think we see that even as adults. It's really, and I like this thought, it's really an inappropriate way to offer information. So instead of learning about animals on an app, we should be learning about animals by observing them in nature, right? Offering information through screens. We said that. Okay. So anytime, and we've talked about this before, anytime you can offer a child sort of the essence of something, that's a lot better than offering them, a screen, right? So let's say, I don't know, you want to talk about lemons or something like that, right? Oh, this is a lemon. This is what it looks like on the screen. No, let's cut up the lemon. Let's see how it feels. Let's see how it tastes, anything. So offering the essence of something is important. So the child's, of course, as we know, eyes and brains are fixed to the screen for a long time, which makes it hard for them to leave. Addiction. I'm addicted to my phone as well. So that's one of my deviations. This strong stimulation is not manageable. It's really hard, right? We often have to set time limits. You're on the TV, or now you're on your tablet, or, your parent's phone, for 30 minutes. And oftentimes you'll see tantrums when you take them off technology. So again, that strong stimulation is not manageable. It becomes harder for the child to learn then from real activities. I struggled with that as my first year as a Montessori teacher. Here we're offering these beautiful materials. Some students, they're not interested in the pink tower, right? They want to go on their tablet or their mom's phone and get all of those, sensory that they can get from technology. So it can be challenging because when they come to us, even at 3, they already have sort of those deviations and addictions to technology. And with that, they're not using their mind and their physical body together. So after they have been exposed to the screen for long periods of time, they need to process it, right? And so they can't screen the contents of the program. They take in everything when we talk about absorbent mind, right? They can't decipher the commercials from the program, and so even after they're off, they're still sort of processing that. Right. Well, that was challenging for us, as you know, Carmen, because when we went remote, we were like, we don't, we try not to promote screen time. So I think in the primary rooms, I think we were going with less than an hour of remote time with the teacher. I think it was like 30 minutes of, like the threes would get together for 30 minutes and then we'd have group time for 30 minutes. And so we tried to be cognizant of that. Now, as they get older, yes, I hear you. I hear you. I understand. My daughter has her own phone and she's on it a lot, and it's challenging. It's challenging. And we can all fall into that. We can't always say, take the time to do, like I said, to offer the essence of something as opposed to just showing that, on technology. We actually are planning a parent education night in April, and we're going to have sort of a month of screen time. So we're going to have somebody come in and talk about that in April for a parent education night. So that's exciting. But yeah, again, when we were talking about, remote, I think it was less than an hour. We weren't, and that's why I think those Montessori kits were very important to us when we were sending those home, right? We want the children using as close to what we can get to, a classroom setting as opposed to being online with the teacher. We're going to give you a quick lesson online, and then you're going to go and pull out those activities from the Montessori kit and work on those. And it was difficult, when students came back in spring, because they were used to being on those Chromebooks and tablets. But we made an effort we're going to put those aside and we're going to back to using materials. Even, I think most of our 3s and 4s don't even bring technology to class anymore. What do you mean by interactive? Like a game where you're playing with like somebody else and like talking with somebody else?
I mean, playing any sort of game that requires you to actually engage your brain versus sitting and watching TV or sitting and watching YouTube.
I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but in my opinion, I would still want that child not reading a book on screen, but actually picking up a physical book. And I know sometimes we don't have, all of those options. I don't know, this is just me, but I don't know why, but that like some of those commercials for like those reading apps really bother me, because I'm like, pick up a book, just read a book to your child, right? Like, I get it. My daughter was on, back in the day, I feel so old. I had like a Nook. Well, I had books for her to read, but that was out of convenience, right? But it's much better having that physical book in front of you. Some of you may have heard this story, but when the technology team came to me, I think my first year on the job, they said, "Oh, we have some exciting news. Every child is going to get one-on-one technology." And I was like, no, thanks. I'd rather have the encyclopedias in the library. I'd rather have a really robust, reference section in the library. And Natalia, our tech coordinator, and I were just talking about that. I mean, they looked at me like I was crazy. So they said, well, we have Encyclopedia Britannica, the app, and they can just go on there. I go, nope, there is something about flipping through the pages of a book. There's something there, right? And so thank you, Carmen, and thank you, PTA. It's so exciting to see those encyclopedias in the library now. They're beautiful. The teachers are really excited about them. So, there's something to that. Did I answer your question? Probably not.
I think you overrode my question with a better answer, to get a book instead of technology. So that's fair.
Yeah. But, I think there's a benefit, obviously, to technology. But when we're talking about learning, I think learning needs to not come from technology. It needs to come from, books and our materials, if we're talking about in the classroom. Now, certainly, as students get older, we are incorporating technology more because it's necessary. It's the world we live in. But for the younger ones, for sure, when I walk into a lower L classroom, there are usually one or two students on their device, either doing IXL or doing some research items. But again, that is in a very limited fashion. I would rather have students using the materials, where they can touch and they can feel, they can sense, numbers as opposed to just seeing it on a screen. Yes, Miss Hart, what's your question? Did you have a question? Okay, you can type it in the chat if you wish. All right, so what are some specific deviations? She talks about psychic fugues. So if the child is not given an opportunity to engage in activities which allow the mind and body to work together, his psychic energy and movement development separate. The child takes refuge in fantasy because his psychic energy doesn't have an aim. The child with psychic fugues cannot find anything interesting in the real world. And I have seen this happen, right? Like they get attached to that potentially, technology, and nothing, like I said, they don't find a lot of things interesting in the real life. The child seeks stimulation, and in the fantasy world, the child may have experienced pain in the real world, hence going to fantasy. These children often move restlessly. They leave unfinished activities and are unable to concentrate on an activity. Often adults misinterpret this as creativity or that it is normal for young children. These children need to be attached to reality again. And first, plain children need to know where they live and their environment. She also talks about psychic barriers. So this child builds psychic barriers when the child has a frightening experience that they do not want to face anymore. And we would probably, she was, as we talk about now, of course, this is sort of trauma, right? This may be called a mental block, and they will withdraw into himself or herself. If the child builds more than one barrier, they could potentially isolate themselves. Once a child develops barriers, it's hard to break down these barriers, and sometimes professional help is needed. Those children need to be treated delicately, or they will develop more barriers to defend themselves. We also, another specific deviation is attachment. So if a child's psychic energy is weak, the child will develop excessive attachments to adults. And I certainly, have seen all of these. These children have not had a chance to develop their will because of an adult that is too influential to the child. So when you're talking about, a parent who is sort of controlling everything and not giving that freedom to the child, then the child sort of develops, this dependency on the adult in an unhealthy way. And sometimes, adults don't notice that it's unhealthy, and they may think the child is just sensitive or affectionate. So we need to give the child opportunities to become independent. And we need to be careful to not build a codependent relationship. And another one is possessiveness. So the strong-willed child will express this desire vigorously. They see what they want. They fight over objects, or they steal. And this can then become a pattern, like we talked about, in part of our personality. If the child has possessiveness deviations, they have no satisfaction through experiences. We also have a desire for power. We see this, often in the primary and lower classrooms. They have this desire for power and they want to gain it from their environment. They try and gain it from the environment and want it limitlessly. Once the adult responds to the demands of the child, they'll want it more and they want more and more power. So clear limits, of course, are important. The child is unconsciously trying to investigate the limits. Adults may need to say no. We need to say no. Really, the child is wanting to hear that, right? Children need limits. And that can be challenging. Okay, also inferiority. The child can develop feelings of inferiority when people around him do not respond to him in such a way that he feels not respected or accepted for who they are. And we really want to build that sense of confidence in a child, and that again comes from being independent, right? I'm independent. I can zipper my jacket. That breeds confidence and hopefully negates that sense of inferiority. If we're constantly doing things for our kids, they may feel like they can't do it, right? So we want to give them that time and space to be confident, to do things for themselves. And I think when people come into classrooms, they really are surprised at how independent our students are, whether it's snack. 3-year-olds getting their own china plate and putting their snack together, and then, of course, eating snack and then washing their own dish, putting it where it goes. That breeds confidence, right? And we're hoping, obviously, to not have this deviation of inferiority, because if it's always done for us, how do we know what we're capable of? Okay. And then she also talks about fear and line as deviations. And again, these are very common, and we can see these in the primary and lower L, classrooms as well. Okay. Any questions on any of those? Do any of those sort of resonate with you? Okay, so now what? Because after I was, I put this together, I was like, geez, this is like heavy. It may, we are responsible for bringing up these humans in, an optimal, right, environment. So now what? So going with that, giving your child freedom, in the physical sort of sense of the word, especially, when they're really building themselves and their senses, giving them that physical freedom to move about. But of course, that comes with building like an optimal environment for that to happen as well. So responding to their needs, really trying to build up that concentration, giving them purposeful work is important. And I think as parents, ask questions of your teachers, work with the teachers. If you have any questions like, oh, I'm seeing this, what do you think this means? Keeping up that communication. That is it for my presentation. Does anyone have any questions, comments?
This was really good timing prior to conferences. So thanks for providing this.
You're welcome. Good. Yeah, and I don't want it to be, like I said, we all have deviations. all of us, right? That's what make us, I guess, unique. But that's again why I love Montessori, and she was a genius, and the way we set up our space is so intentional. You know, having that prepared environment, and those materials are laid out specifically. Just even the preparation of the teacher herself is so important. Um, and it's all about the process. Um, and getting these students to be the best humans we can. Any other questions? Yes. Hang on, I gotta open this up. Amount of friend time. Normal friend. Oh, you like in the classroom? So, just kind of being social in the classroom. You know, yeah, that's sort of built into the Montessori classroom. Is when I actually met with the superintendent the other day, I did talk about, we don't expect our students to be working 100% of the time. I don't work 100% of the time, and when I'm in my office, I may take a break. I'm working 80% of the time. All of us do, right? And so when we're in the classroom, we allow that freedom to communicate with our peers. If you're seeing that as an issue, or if they're not concentrating, usually they will know and they'll pull themselves back, right? Like, I'm working, but yet I may need just a mental break. I'm going to get up and go talk with somebody, and that's allowed. I rarely have seen it as an issue where I'm just going to talk to this person and I'm just going to move about the classroom for the next hour. Typically, students, they know after the fulfilling conversation has happened, they'll return to work. But if you think something more is going on, you certainly can, talk to Miss Missy. Oh, well, yeah, no, that's an important, that socialization piece is an important part of our classroom, especially, when we talk about first plane children. That's why our classrooms are set up differently from first plane primary to lower L. In primary, you're going to see more single desks and single workspaces. And when we get to lower L, there's almost no single spaces, because those children really need that socialization, and they like to learn from their peers and be with their peers, and they thrive on that. But yeah, the socialization piece is big, even in the primary room. And that's what's great about just having those older children in the afternoon. They're given then even sort of more time, because they're all at that same level, right? 5, some of them turning 6. So some of them are already in that second plane and really need that social piece with their peers. And so they're able to do that. And again, they're usually pretty good at, knowing when, to stop the conversation and go back to work. And certainly in the afternoon, the teachers are obviously more cognizant of that, because if there's only, let's say 10 students in the classroom, and they can see, okay, you took a 5-10 minute break, you now can go back, to your work. And that's why, honestly, I think I love our snack time as well, because that's part of our culture, right? When we're eating with other people, that's a really great socialization piece too. Sometimes I used to have my EA sit and, sit down and have snack with a student, and that allows us a time to model appropriate, behavior or appropriate conversations, with people. And so, yeah, socialization is a really big, being social is a big part of our classroom, and, it's allowed to happen because it's necessary. Sometimes you get some students who, chat a lot together, and then they need to be, asked to either work separately or, calm it down a bit. But I think we tend to like them, socializing as long as it's appropriate. Any other questions? So she likes to be social. Is that what you're saying, Carmen? Yes. No, that's good. And I'm sure if she was having issues, Miss Missy would let you know. But yeah, no, that's developing those skills. And again, that breeds, confidence as well. Like I'm a confident person. I can get out and, speak to other people. But again, those social breaks are necessary in our classroom. They're necessary for me when I'm in this now what I'm calling like this cave. It's like I'll just open my door and I'm like, I have to get out. I have to go into classrooms and like talk to people. So it's a necessary part of our work. Any other questions, comments? Does anyone have any other questions or comments not related to normalization or deviations that I can answer for you? You're welcome. Okay, well, thank you all so very much for joining. I can't believe we're on March. Wow, it's going to be March. Crazy. Yes, parent education nights are virtual. And if you got the Wednesday wireless yesterday, we have a great guest. You're welcome. We have a great guest speaker coming in March 10th, and she's going to be talking about the brain and literacy. And Miss Mary Ann was in one of her conferences, I believe, and asked her to come and speak. And so we're really excited to have her. So hopefully you can tune into that parent education night, March 10th at 6:00. And that link was sent out yesterday in the Wednesday wireless. It'll also be in the March newsletter. Yeah, and look for the screen time. I think, like I said, I think we're doing that in April. It may be May, but I think it's April. And so we have somebody set up to come and talk about screen time. Okay, again, thank you all so very much.